Looking for a fun, different new shirt? Something related to the things you like? Climbing in the outdoors, perhaps philosophy? Visit our new store, theDIHEDRAL Goods, on Etsy, and you'll find all that and much more.
I'm on! Roll! Hello everyone, this is Carrot, welcoming you to another episode of the theDIHEDRAL podcast. Today we have the opportunity to chat with one of the all-time greats. He's the author of several books, including Wittgenstein's Poker, Rousseau's Dog, Would You Kill the Fat Man, and Undercover Robot, My First Year as a Human. Along with Nigel Warburton, he also co-hosts the most spectacular podcast ever produced, Philosophy Bites, with fellowships at both the University of Chicago and the University of Michigan. He is the pride of Oxford, Dr. David Edmonds. David, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
So I'm hoping we can start our discussion with a quick synopsis of your 2020 book, Undercover Robot, My First Year as a Human. How would you describe that book?
Oh, blimey. It's about a girl who's not actually a girl. She's a robot, but she has to pass as a girl and survive undetected for a year. And she's in competition with a number of other robots around the world who are also trying to pass themselves off as human. And the winner of the competition wins a huge amount of money. And so it's basically about artificial intelligence and really what it is to be human and the difference between humans and robots.
It's just an outstanding book, and I hope to get into some of the details as we move on in our conversation. But I was kind of wondering about your motivation. This book came out 2 years before the current AI wave. It came out before ChatGPT was on the radar for most of the public. And so I'm wondering if your timing was just a matter of luck or if you guys saw the writing on the wall.
Well, we're both interested in AI and computing, and this was something that married our interests. So I've got a co-author who's named as Bertie Fraser, which is his pen name, but he's a techie guy. I'm very interested in philosophy. In fact, I've just edited a book on AI. So this was a good way of writing a children's story. That's what it is. It's a children's story, but having lots of philosophy in it. So it's full of philosophical conundrums. And yeah, I think we did both foresee the fact that computing and artificial intelligence was going to become increasingly significant in our lives. And we were trying to grapple with some of the issues that would bring about.
I've been spending the last couple of years reading about artificial intelligence and the future of humanity specifically. And I know this is kind of directed at children, but this is one of the best books on the topic that I've read because it shows the reader how applicable some of these real issues are. It covers a deep array of philosophical topics, as you mentioned, like personal identity, aesthetic value, language, and two of the more pressing issues within artificial intelligence, namely the control problem and the alignment problem. And so I think you and Bertie do a great job of sort of bringing these out. And I wonder how did you come to address these specific issues? And by that, I mean, they can be really scary, but you also write them in a way that's applicable to everybody, including children.
Yeah, well, each chapter has got a philosophical issue at the heart of it, and there's lots of ongoing issues. So obviously one ongoing issue is the nature of consciousness and how human beings differ from robots. There's something subtle that goes on slowly. So Dottie's language, which you may not have noticed, becomes more human as the book progresses. This is something we were careful to write in, although I don't think all readers will have spotted it. And as far as the philosophical problems were concerned, they were just sort of organic. So what worked best for the plot? So we have, as you say, we've got one chapter where Dottie forges a work of art, and the question is, well, what's the difference between a perfect forgery and the original? We've got one chapter which is basically on the trolley problem, where Dottie is going to be that there's a bear masquerade charging down the hill, and Dottie can either redirect the bear and it will attack many people, or it will go in the direction it's going and it will attack her and her family. So there was the trolley problem. There are lots of little issues that come up. So Dottie has got an algorithm and she's trying to work out, when is a bald man bald? You know, how many hairs does a bald man have to have on
perfect.
his head to be bald? Which is a very complicated philosophical problem, but deeply complicated for an algorithm, because it looks like you've got to set a number. I mean, there are some philosophers who think that there is an actual hair that makes the difference between baldness and not baldness. But Dottie has to grapple with that issue as well. I mean, I've got a philosophical background. Hugh, or Bertie, as he's named on the book, he doesn't. But all the names, something else you probably didn't spot, but all the names almost all the names are plays on philosophy. So the school is called Brussels Academy. That's Bertrand Russell, B. Russell. All the other names are anagrams of philosophers. I mean, again, nobody would have spotted this, but just for my amusement, that they live in 10 Buckingham Street, which was where Rousseau and Hume met in London. So it's full of little London references, philosophical references, and in jokes, which of course no 10-year-old or 11-year-old child is going to get. But we're really just there for my own amusement.
No, I think that, at least for me, that amusement kind of stuck out because, you know, as I'm reading, I'm just kind of asking myself, it's like, this is intentional. And you look at some of the names of the directors and the people who are kind of working at the school. I'm like, this is really quite brilliant and really entertaining.
Thank you.
Yeah. So that being said, how did you write for children? It seems really, really hard to take some of those issues that you brought up and like spin them in a way that a 10-year-old or an 11-year-old, 9-year-old would be able to comprehend and think about, and really get started on some kind of philosophical journey.
Well, I owe most of it to my co-author, Hugh. So Hugh has a children's podcast called Story Nori, and he writes a lot for kids. And I have a philosophy podcast, and so we were bringing together Hugh's storytelling skills and my philosophical background to make a book for children about philosophy. So all the kind of brilliant writing is almost all down to Hugh, and I add the ideas and the philosophy, and you know, we worked on the plot together. But you know, Hugh is much better at character than me, and you know, so I think he's responsible for the kind of style of the writing, really. I mean, we worked over sort of every line together, but all the creative stuff is done by Hugh.
What a brilliant book. I kind of want to like continue the conversation maybe a little bit more philosophically on the notion of children as philosophers. I've had conversations with colleagues about this. You know, there's no doubt that children ask really good questions, and a great attribute that I think a lot of kids encompass is that they're not afraid to ask questions or afraid to be wrong. And of course, there's the other side. I think Aristotle might say that children aren't philosophers. I'm not even sure what level of person he considers them, because they don't have the ability to think analytically in ways that maybe an adult would. So I was wondering where you stand on the question of whether or not children should be considered some kind of philosopher.
No, I think children are very good philosophers, and you know, I think my philosophical hero Wittgenstein would probably have agreed, really. And often philosophers as adults get themselves entangled in issues and become confused in a way that children wouldn't become confused, because philosophers have developed a jargon and a way of thinking about things which confuses themselves. And I think children naturally ask interesting philosophical questions. Lots of their intuitions are shared with, I think, adults, particularly, you know, by the time they're 8 or 9, particularly moral intuitions. I think that's true of things like the trolley problem, where you get 8 or 9-year-olds having quite strong intuitions about what's right or wrong, which they share with adults. And interestingly, neither children nor adults can articulate why they have these intuitions. But I think generally, I've got kids of my own, they're very good at asking the why question. and they often get to the nub of an issue very quickly. They don't get distracted by some of the intricacies that sometimes adults, and particularly adult philosophers, get entangled with. So yeah, I think they're natural philosophers. I think they're naturally interested in these issues. We've had a good response from kids from this book. I don't know, of course, they don't know it's a philosophy book. They're absorbing the issues and the puzzles, and I guess they get to talk about it with teachers and with parents, but they don't realize, thank God, that they're basically having a sort of crash course in 101 philosophy.
That's such a good way to put it. I think professional philosophers, we've all had those experiences where we're just trying to have a conversation with other philosophers, and all of a sudden we get hung up on whether or not we should be using an and or an or, and everything is off the tracks after that. So I love the way that you put that. I mean, kids aren't really getting hung up on in some of the weeds that we as professionals sort of do. That's brilliant. So hopefully you don't mind shifting gears a little bit and talking about what I think is I mean, very subjectively, the best podcast that's ever existed, Philosophy Bites. I personally have students in my honors ethics classes use it. I don't think I've taken a road trip without your voice and Nigel's voice blasting in the background through the speakers. And so, if you don't mind indulging us, can you tell us how Philosophy Bites came to be?
Well, there is a connection with the children's book, because I mentioned my co-author for the children's book, Hugh, who has this children's podcast. And of course, I knew about this podcast. In fact, I went to cover it for the BBC. I was part-time for many years at the BBC. I left 3 years ago. And I did a little feature about Hugh and his podcast. And I was amazed at the time that he had 40,000 downloads a month. This was back in 2005. And I thought that was a huge number. Of course, we now get hundreds of thousands. But at the time I was amazed by it. And I didn't really know Nigel Warburton, who's now my co-podcaster on Philosophy Bites, but we'd had a discussion about a book I was writing about Rousseau and Hume, and I went to see him give an interview. He was interviewing somebody else, and he was extremely good at it. And he's also very techy. I think he already had a podcast where he was reading out some chapters of a book that he had written and putting those online. So he was much more techy than me, and I thought together we could produce this podcast, and we were way ahead of everybody else. So we started in 2007. We definitely had first mover advantage, and we post less sporadically. We should probably speed up, but there's so many now that we kind of feel that if you want to get a good philosophical education, you could listen to the whole of the backlist of Philosophy Bites, and basically it would be the equivalent of doing 4 or 5 philosophy degrees, because there were hundreds and hundreds of them.
Oh yeah.
I mean, from the beginning, although there weren't many other podcasts around, we had a very distinct vision, which is, unlike 95% of podcasts, we didn't want them to go on and on and on and on and on. So I edit them quite heavily, because as I explained, I've got a background in the BBC. I quite enjoy editing. I cut them down. So the idea is that anything extraneous, if it can be removed, gets removed.
That's great.
And my general rule is, 40% of whatever anybody says is is extraneous and can happily be removed without removing any substance. And so you can cut things down, and so the podcasts tend to be they start off about 13, 14 minutes. They've crept longer and longer, so they're about 18, 20 minutes now. And they just focus on one particular topic. And initially we thought we'd just do 100, and we would cover the whole of philosophy. We thought we could have done philosophy in 100 podcasts. We've now done hundreds and hundreds, and there were still big gaps. So we could go on forever, but it is relatively comprehensive now. So, if you want to know about Descartes or Aristotle or Plato or Hume or Wittgenstein, you'll find enough podcasts on Philosophy Bites to at least get you going.
If you don't mind, you don't have to answer this. In terms of guests, do you find yourself reaching out to guests based on your interests, or at this point are guests reaching out to you, just clamoring for the opportunity to sit on the show?
Well, it definitely started with us reaching out to them. That was partly because there was no culture of podcasting.
Sure.
And so nobody came to us. Now we are faced with the opposite problem, which is we're sort of bombarded often by PR companies and marketing companies representing authors. But we like to do it the other way around. We do like to decide who we want to interview and approach them. And often we're slightly, not always, we sometimes say yes when people approach us. But on the whole, we like to work out who we want to interview and approach them rather than the other way around.
Just as a side note, whether you want to do anything with this or not, but I think the philosopher's name, and she just came out with a new book, was Roche. She did one on swearing several years.
Rebecca Roach.
Roach,
Rebecca
that's right.
Roach.
And
Yeah.
that I let my honor students pick like which ones they want, as long as there's some kind of ethical. Every semester, I'll have almost every student in the class pick that one. It's very popular.
She's absolutely brilliant, and you should tell your students to read her book.
Okay.
On swearing, which is a fantastic book, and it's both beautifully written and I think kind of just philosophically very, very rich. So I recommend it, and she's a very good speaker as well. So I think your students have got good taste. I think that is a
that's great.
Very good philosophy bite.
So I personally look at philosophy bites, and you kind of alluded to this in saying that if you listen to all of them, you get the equivalent of several philosophy degrees. I look at this as a realistic academic resource, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are as learning takes a more kind of tech approach. Do you have any thoughts on what the future of education, scholastically and academically, might look like?
Well, I certainly think that podcasts like Philosophy Bites, there's also lots of other forms of public philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
There are philosophy essays that are now much more easily accessible on the internet than they used to be. There's a lot of philosophy around on the internet, and I think Philosophy Bites plays into that, and it definitely has a role. I wouldn't want to see the old system entirely replaced.
Sure.
You know, there's definitely an important role for personal contact and for discussion and for conversation. Of course, philosophy, but you're just listening. It's very passive.
Great
Whereas
point.
one wants philosophy to be active and there to be a conversation between student and teacher. And Philosophy Bites can't do that, nor can an article do that. So I think it supplements the old way of doing things very nicely, but I very much hope that it doesn't replace it.
That's great. Such a good answer. Look, I'm not sure how you feel about the work that you do, but your conversations with these very prominent philosophers are just so natural and seem to flow. And maybe it's just like the magic of editing, so seamless. Now, I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about what you do to prepare and how you come off as just such a great interlocutor for so many philosophers.
Well, Nigel does most of the interviews. I do a percentage. Nigel's much better than me at improvising.
I gotcha.
I tend to be obsessive about kind of reading around the subject and researching what the philosopher has written and so on. Nigel's much better, I think, at listening than me and responding on the hoof. And he has a very natural conversational style, I think. And also he's a very good philosopher and very good at spotting, and this is a real philosophical skill that not all philosophers have. He's very good at spotting the nub of an issue, what the crux of an issue, what really matters, and getting to the heart of what's at stake. So they are conversations, and we certainly, sometimes we send people the rough framework of what we have in mind, but we don't want it to be scripted. That's very, very important to us, that we want people to think on their feet. And you can tell when a conversation is scripted, and we definitely don't want that. So, we do some research. We've only approached people because we're interested in their work, so we already know something about them. But then we don't exactly know where a conversation will go. Because I edit, and most podcasts are not edited, if we go down a tributary that doesn't work, a cul-de-sac, I can remove it, and hopefully the listener is none the wiser. So that's roughly how we approach our interviews.
You guys have been doing this for what, over nearly 20 years, right? And it would be impossible, I think, to pick out your favorite episode or your favorite guest, but I'm wondering if you might be able to share with us maybe a memorable experience or a couple of your most memorable experiences.
Well, I can connect it to something that we were just talking about, the fact that I edit and that I do tend to take out, I would say, roughly 40% of a conversation. And I think I do that and I lose almost no important content. I wouldn't take it out if it was important. I leave in everything I think is relevant. But there's one philosopher who is unique, I think, in the whatever it is, 17 years we've been doing this, in that I was not able to edit anything.
Oh, wow.
Because every single parenthesis, paraphrase, sentence was grammatically perfect. Every word was in the right place. Everything that was said was worth saying. And I literally couldn't take anything out. And that was a guy called Quentin Skinner, who's a professor of sort of political ideas. He was at Cambridge and at Queen Mary. He's, extraordinary bloke, fantastically articulate. I even in my interviews, I try and take out sort of lots of the ums and ahs, but there
Yeah,
was nothing to take out with Quentin
amazing.
because he doesn't and ah. So I will never forget those interviews because, well, they made my life extremely easy. They could go up posted as they were recorded.
That's I can't wait to listen to it. Actually, just listen to you were a guest on the show recently. I thought that was really cool.
I was, yeah. I was talking about my last book, which was on Derek Parfit, who was actually my BPhil supervisor when I was at Oxford, and I wrote my dissertation on obligations to future people. And Derek Parfit is the giant figure in philosophy when it comes to thinking about future generations, people who are not yet born, and what we owe to them.
So, I mean, this kind of goes along with that. The show is really unique at this point because there's a lot of guests that you've had who have since passed, and we have the recordings that we can listen to them and learn from them still because of what you guys have done on the show. And I'm wondering how you view your impact on the world of philosophy. It's so unique in that you've been able to talk to so many people, and you think about some philosophers are just locked in their own room writing their own stuff, or you have some of the ancient philosophers bouncing ideas off of each other, but hundreds of great philosophers you've been able to bring to us and share with us. And I'm wondering how you view your impact on the philosophical world.
I don't know. I wouldn't sort of exaggerate it. I'm very proud of the archive. I mean, I'm very, very proud of it. We've got so many great philosophers on it. As you say, quite a few of them now, very sadly, have passed. And still to have the voices of Ronnie Dworkin and Jerry Cohen and Michael Dummett and
Mhm.
all these other great philosophers, I think is very valuable. That they're all there in a way that there is diminishing marginal utility to that aspect of it, because now there are so many podcasts that well-known philosophers can be found in many places now. But the kind of people we were interviewing, especially in the early days, there weren't many recordings of them, and we do have now recordings of all these great figures. So yeah, I'm very, very proud of the archive. We've had roughly 50 million downloads or close to it. So that's great for two people who we do it basically as a hobby, and it's recorded in our lounge or our study or mixed in our bathroom or whatever. And yeah, to have had that impact on the profession is very nice. So I wouldn't exaggerate its impact. It's a work of public philosophy. It's making ideas accessible to a wider world as well as to other people in the profession. But we've done it partly for those lovely altruistic reasons, but also just because it's fun. We
Yeah.
get the chance to meet all these great philosophers. We think that we get a fantastic philosophical education. We're not having to pay for it. We get to meet these people free of charge. And just as if you listen to all the podcasts, you get the equivalent of many philosophy degrees. We've had that as well without having to pay for any of it. And we've met all these wonderful philosophers. So for us, it's a total privilege to do it. So, that's what keeps us going, really.
I think you kind of answered my next thought that was just sort of occurring, like with 50 million or so downloads, you guys still are essentially open source and ad free. And I'm sure there's advertisers who are clamoring to like put something on the show. And so I'm wondering why you guys keep it or so organic.
Yeah, well, we've been hopeless at monetizing it, partly because we're not really. Well, it's not that we're not interested in monetizing it completely. It's just we don't really want advertising. We have been approached often, all the time, by people promising us money through adverts. But I listen to some of these other podcasts, non-philosophy podcasts, and sometimes they're very well-known people, and they're wealthy people, and they now have to read out these 30-second ads with them promoting, soap powder or something. I don't want to do that. I haven't gone into Philosophy Bites so that I can tell people to buy this soap powder rather than that soap powder. I would feel, maybe I'm very purist about it, but I would feel sort of sullied by that. I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
So sometimes what happens is that a university will come to us, and they'll sponsor a show or two, or something that we can be proud to be associated with, and we're very happy to do that.
Right.
But what we don't want to do is we don't want to promote non-philosophical products. That's not why we've done it. And so yeah, we've rejected every single advance like that.
So the show operates primarily on donations, and I'm wondering if you can tell our listeners if they want to donate or have an inclination to donate, how they might do that.
Well, there's a website. They can just go to the website, philosophybites.com. And people do donate. It's extremely kind of them because they don't need to. They get nothing extra by donating. So it's remarkable. People think that humans are entirely self-interested. Philosophy Bites, in a way, is proof that that's not the case, because you get nothing by donating. Right. Sometimes with some of these subscription services, you get extra by donating. We have an appeal saying, if you want to help us, feel free to donate. And people do donate. And there's absolutely no reason for them to donate, because they get nothing extra by donating. And yet, people still do it. So, we're very grateful to them. And yeah, they can just go on our website and sign up, subscribe to us or whatever.
That might have been the worst sales pitch I've ever heard in my life. I love everything about it. All right. So if we can just concentrate, maybe look at the future for a second. I love your writing. There's certain books that you've written. Wittgenstein's Poker comes to mind, when I read in undergrad, and it really changes everything. I mean, I got so into Popper, for example, from that book, and it helped me understand Wittgenstein a little bit. But it's amazing. Your books are great. And so that being said, is there anything in the works coming down the chute that we can expect from you over the next couple of years?
Well, just today, a book arrived that I've edited on AI ethics. So, that plugs into the children's book, Undercover Robot. But the main book I've been working on is a book about Peter Singer's thought experiment called The Shallow Pond, which is a thought experiment that he comes up with in 1971 at the time of the Bangladeshi War of Independence, where he's wondering about what our obligations are to people on the far side of the world. And he imagines that you're walking past a shallow pond and there's a young child who's drowning in the shallow pond, and you're about to save the young child. There's nobody else around. You're about to wade into the shallow pond when you notice you're wearing your best shoes, or you're wearing a nice suit that you will destroy if you go into the shallow pond. And he asks a rhetorical question, which is, should you basically worry about your shoes or your suit, or should you worry about the child's life? And obviously, it's a rhetorical question. Nobody says, oh, really, you should be more concerned with your shoes than the life. Everybody says, what a ridiculous question. You should obviously save the child's life. And he says, well, every day of our lives, we're in the equivalent of a shallow pond scenario. We're the equivalent of walking past a shallow pond. Each person of moderate means has sufficient spare resources to give to charity, to save a life on the other side of the world, in Bangladesh or whatever. And by failing to do that, we are no better than the person who wouldn't walk into the shallow pond because they're worried about their shoes or their suit.
Yeah.
And so I'm writing a book about that. It's a very controversial claim, lots of objections to it. So the book explains the history of the thought experiment and also explains all the attempted objections to it as an analogy with the real world.
Oh, thank you. That sounds great. I can't wait for it to come out. That sounds awesome. Just a few more things in wrapping up. The dihedral is underlying everything. We're a bunch of rock climbers who have various interests. I'm wondering if you've ever been in the mountains or had a chance to go rock climbing.
I've never been rock climbing. I've climbed, especially as a kid, a lot of mountains because my dad liked climbing mountains. I mean, not very, very high mountains, but yeah, I mean, when I look back at it, I'm amazed that as a child, we were prepared to do it. As a 6-year-old, we went up Ben Nevis, which is the highest mountain in Great Britain. And, you know, I've got kids of my own. I have to incentivize them with all sorts of things to get them to do almost anything. My dad incentivized us with a segment of orange to get to the top of Ben Nevis. The other thing we did get actually is my mother, every time we climbed a mountain, would sew on. Every mountain had a badge. I don't know if that still exists now, but there was every mountain had a badge. So if you climbed up Ben Nevis, there was a Ben Nevis badge that you could sew onto your anorak or your coat.
That's
So
so cool.
we had coats that were full of these badges of mountains that we'd climbed. As I don't know, just I guess they're to kind of show off, really.
Yeah.
How many mountains you've managed to do. But anyway, so I don't know. So I climbed as a kid. I love walking, so I still love walking. But with I don't do any very high mountains now, but we still walk a lot.
I really love that. A badge and a segment of orange get you up the mountain. All right. So, just being that you've had the opportunity to speak to so many great philosophers, I wonder if you might be willing to recommend a couple of books to our listeners who might not be, professional philosophers, but certainly are philosophy adjacent. So, is there any book, and it doesn't have to be a guest necessarily, but if there's just a couple of books that you would recommend to people who maybe tiptoe into philosophy, that would be awesome.
Well, a writer I love who combines accessibility with depth is Thomas Nagel. And well, I'd recommend at least 2 of his books. One is Mortal Questions. I don't know how old Mortal Questions is. It must be, gosh, it must be 40 years old at least now, I would think.
Yeah.
Where he has questions about whether life is absurd, meaning of life, and all sorts of questions. And then he writes this fantastic book, which is one of my favorite philosophy books of all time, which is called, is it The View from Nowhere or A View from Nowhere?
Yeah.
Again, it's a fantastic book. And he has this idea that what makes us distinctively human is that we have both subjective and objective perspectives. So, for example, subjectively, I feel like I'm free. I feel like I can lift my left hand, I can lift my right hand, I can go out the door, I can decide to stay inside. I'm free to do what I want. It feels subjectively from the inside that I'm free. And yet we have this objective perspective where we realize we're just made up of atoms and molecules. We're part of the physical universe, and we must be subject to the same causal laws as every other part of the physical universe. And so there's this tension between the subjective and the objective. And he applies that to a whole bunch of philosophical questions. And so it doesn't answer it, but it does explain why these philosophical puzzles exist in the first place, that we've got this tension between the subjective and the objective perspective.
Yeah, Nagel's brilliant. A lot of people can really think deeply philosophically and maybe not communicate it great. Nagel's great at communicating and thinking. Nagel, Bernard Williams is, I think, somewhat similar too. But those are excellent book recommendations. Thank you very much for that. And I agree completely. So one final question that I thought might be sort of fun. Let's mention just somebody who you haven't had a chance to interview. It can be living or dead, it doesn't matter. If you could pick one person from the past to have on the show, and then take out to lunch, who would you select, and then where would you take them?
Uh,
Yeah, that's a tough
well,
one.
it's a tough one. I would, well, in the world of philosophy, in a way, it's tough, but for me, it's quite easy. I would invite Wittgenstein for
Awesome.
lunch, and I would take him to what we would call a greasy spoon. I don't know if you have. Do you have that
Yeah,
term
yeah,
in America?
we do for
It's
sure.
just so it's where you can get kind of fish chips and egg chips and beans basically, and it's kind of cheap and cheerful food, because he wouldn't appreciate high quality food, and he would probably um, he'd sort of resent the pristine tablecloth and the furniture, and I mean he would probably end up being very rude to me, I think, during the course of the
You just
lunch,
got to
but
take it.
I wouldn't mind. I think I wouldn't mind because I wouldn't take it personally,
Yeah.
and I would like to be in the presence of genius, and we'd end up. I don't know what we'd end up talking about. He liked cowboy movies. He liked crime novels, and I like crime novels. So we could talk about Agatha Christie or whatever, and yeah, we'd have a he would be rude. I would take that, but we'd have an interesting conversation about possibly not philosophy because yeah, I think he would have even less patience talking about that than talking about some other sort of subjects. But yeah, I'd like to spend an hour talking about crime novels with Ludwig Wittgenstein in a greasy spoon.
Done. That sounds amazing. Before we go, is there anything that we didn't get a chance to touch on, or anything that you would like to spotlight or promote in the time that we have?
Gosh, not really. Not really. You've covered a lot of ground. Yeah, check out Philosophy Bites, and yeah, I'd like to promote my last book, Parfit, because
Yeah.
although it's a kind of it's about an obscure topic, because not many people have heard of Derek Parfit, but it's a book I'm very proud of, and it's a fun book, and it's packed full of ideas, and because Derek is so eccentric, it was a wonderfully easy book to write because it's full of the most extraordinary stories. Because, well, he became more eccentric as he got older, but I did many interviews, over 200 interviews with people who knew him, and I got some marvelous anecdotes. So it's packed. It's rich with kind of human drama, I think, and it's got lots of fascinating philosophy. So yeah, check out the book on Parfit.
I can't wait to read it. David, your company has been an absolute treasure. Thank you so much for joining us today.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much for having me.
If you enjoy listening to adventure stories, then you should visit theDIHEDRAL.com. You will find stories from other members of the community and read about climbing, life, and the outdoors. Follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Let's connect and climb on!
Climb on!